Hi, friends. I just wanted to take a quick pause and share with you something I've been so excited to share. I'm now officially a certified psychedelic practitioner. As you know, this work truly lights me up. I love meeting people no matter where they are in their journey, whether they're just curious about plant medicine and microdosing or looking to take a deeper dive. All of my offerings can be experienced in person or virtually, so we can work together no matter where you live. I'm currently offering 3 programs. The first is Bloom, which is a guided microdosing journey. This program is meant to spark clarity, creativity, and emotional balance. Awaken is a program for those looking to do a deeper dive with medicine. I offer a ceremonial breakthrough experience designed to open new perspectives and shift what's possible in your life. And with Rebirth, my most immersive journey, it combines a ceremonial breakthrough experience followed by ongoing microdosing integration, so your transformation takes root and really starts to grow. Every single journey is held with deep intention, safety, and care. If something in you feels called, trust that feeling. Head on over to Minds on Mushrooms /work with me to view my offerings and learn more. Thank you. Hello, hello, and welcome back to another episode of Minds on Mushrooms. I'm your host, Maggie Kirkwood. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I am really looking forward to talking with my guest today. It's Jennifer Chesak. And I just want to start by saying hello. And
Hi. Thanks for having me.
yes, I think in this line of work, I consider myself a forever student. And I think I'm just really looking forward to connecting with you more because you seem to know about psilocybin and how it can work specifically with women, correct?
Yes.
Great. So I'm super excited to dive deep into this handbook that you created. But first, I was wondering if you wouldn't mind kind of sharing your story behind psilocybin, and if it's beyond psilocybin, I would just love to kind of hear what brought you to, creating this wonderful handbook and coming into this space.
Yeah, thank you so much. So yes, I am the author of the Psilocybin Handbook for Women, which came out in 2023, and I've been kind of doing book tour ever since. I'm a science and medical journalist, and so I had been writing quite extensively about psychedelics in the news as newer research was coming out. And I'm also my another beat of mine is women's health, so it really made sense to merge the two, psilocybin and women's health and how they intersect because there can be differences between the male and the female body in terms of how psilocybin interacts with our hormones, our menstrual cycles, that sort of thing. And so that's kind of the impetus for the book and my background and what I bring to it as for my own personal experience with psilocybin. I was always and I write about this in the book. I was always really hesitant to try it as a young person, and I'm really glad that I didn't because I did not have all the tools necessary or information necessary
Mhm.
to do a journey until like recently when I just had more knowledge about it and really done a deep dive. And so it came to psilocybin by way of like, okay, I cannot write this book unless I try it, even though I'd always been really interested in it for myself. So I did, and I had a really incredible experience. It was absolutely life changing. And then in terms of other psychedelics, I am not well versed in other psychedelics other than just some of the nuances related to that. But I haven't dabbled in other psychedelics beyond psilocybin. And then the only other like sort of drug that I use aside from prescription drugs that I need for migraine and things like that would be cannabis, which I really
Mm.
I use extensively for sleep, for migraine, for chronic pain, and that kind of thing. So that's my only other sort of relation to this. But psilocybin is my area of expertise now.
I got you. I love that. And thank you for sharing. I personally feel such a powerful calling to psilocybin
Mhm.
and yeah, cannabis too has always been a plant that I've worked with for perspective shift and pain relief and sleep. Yeah.
Yes, sleep.
um
Wow.
I have been, kind of toying around with doing low dose psilocybin before bed to encourage lucid dreaming. Have you
Ooh.
I don't know, it's usually when I have my any sort of dose, it does give me energy. So
Yeah.
it's kind of hard to get to this tired state. But I was just on the phone with a client earlier this morning, and she had an amazing lucid dream whilst microdosing. So I don't know.
Nice. Yeah, I haven't
Um,
really tried that, but that's interesting. I do find psilocybin to be somewhat stimulating for me, and I have trouble like being destimulated at night. So
yeah.
I the cannabis works for me for that, but I haven't tried that. I'll have to consider the microdose.
Just an idea.
Mhm.
Well, yeah, let's get right into okay, so you created the psilocybin handbook for women, how magic mushrooms, psychedelic therapy, and microdosing can benefit your mental, physical, and spiritual health. Amazing. Um, if you don't mind, yeah, I would love to kind of, like I said, just dive right in. And I have some questions that
Yeah.
yeah, so first off, yeah, straight up, like how does psilocybin affect women differently?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, I think I'll back up for just a second and let you know that when I started out researching for the book, one thing that I came across that was somewhat surprising to me is that more women are using psychedelics in some cases more frequently than men are,
Mm,
and that came as a surprise. But when I dug a little deeper into the research, it was no longer a surprise because it turns out that when it comes to men and women, and I don't mean to speak in just binary terms, it's just the language in terms of like the survey results is what I'm trying to get at, showed that men and women are using psychedelics a little bit differently. Men tend to come to psychedelics to use them a little bit more recreationally, whereas women are turning to psychedelics to self-treat for conditions that
mm,
they're really not getting adequate care for in the medical system. So I feel like it makes sense that women are doing that, but I also think it's really important that when we talk about that, that we acknowledge that there are differences between the male and the female body, especially with the menstrual cycle. So that's one of the hot topics of the book is, does psilocybin potentially interact differently for women?
mhm,
And it turns out that there is some science behind that, and that has to do with our menstrual cycles. So people have learned through research that basically based on case studies from out of Johns Hopkins University, that with the menstrual cycle, it's possible that that using psilocybin may make your cycle come a little earlier than what you would expect. So you might start your
mm,
bleed a little bit earlier,
mhm.
or you may have a return to a menstrual cycle if you've had an absence of a period for a while. And I don't mean in relation to like menopause, like an absence of a period. I'm
Sure.
talking about if you have a sort of a medical condition that maybe is interfering with your menstrual cycle, perhaps like PCOS or
Mm,
something like that, PMDD or endometriosis, stuff like that.
mm,
So sometimes we have an absence of a period for a while, and so psilocybin may bring it back, may make it come early, or may re-regulate it if you've had a time where you've had like some really irregular cycles. So we do see some promising I mean again, it's very early research and we need more information on this, and
mhm,
studies are in progress now. But it does seem like our menstrual cycles interact a little bit with our with psilocybin. So it may be that where you are in your menstrual cycle would impact your journey, and then
mm,
likewise, using psilocybin may impact your menstrual cycle, which I just sort of explained. But people often want to know, like, why would this even happen? How is there an interaction like that? And it really has to do with our hormones and then the way that our cycles work and the way that our stress response works. So I
mm.
always like to dig into mechanisms because I think that really helps explain things. But
Absolutely.
with our menstrual cycles, they occur on along what's called the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. And what that means is just that our brains, and I know that's a mouthful, but it's our brains are communicating with our ovaries during our menstrual cycle. And when one hormone kicks off, it tells another hormone what to do in this sort of like feedback loop. And this is why we end up with the different phases of our menstrual cycle, such
Mm,
as the follicular phase, and then the luteal phase with
mhm,
ovulation happening in between, and the getting our periods kind of at the beginning beginning of that follicular phase. And so that's the trajectory of the menstrual cycle. But we also have another axis in our bodies. It's called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And this is an
Mm.
axis that controls our stress response. And so when we are using psilocybin, we are activating our serotonin receptors, and that has some activation along that stress response. And just by those names of those axes, the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, you can tell that they sort of overlap in your brain with the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland.
Okay.
And so it makes sense that because of that overlap of these axes, that we may have that psilocybin would impact the menstrual cycle. And we can just think about this from our own lives of having menstrual cycles, is that when you've been stressed out, sometimes that impacts your period. Like it might mean that you have an absence of a period for a month or something like that, or it makes it heavier.
Mhm.
And then likewise, when we get our periods, sometimes we can get a lot more stressed out during that time period. So it makes sense that there's that interaction. So what does this mean in terms of using psilocybin? So I dug into the research there. We don't have a lot of research on that yet. So I reached out to see what we could learn from indigenous wisdom, because of course,
Mm.
when we're
Mhm.
talking about psilocybin at all, we always have to bring in indigenous wisdom, because that's the where the history is and the really good information is there. And
Absolutely.
yes, we're doing this new research now, which is great, but we always have to bridge it with that indigenous wisdom. So I reached out to a wonderful person named Michaela De La Mico, or Michaela Della Mico. I never know if I'm saying her name right,
Mhm.
but she is an expert in indigenous wisdom related to psilocybin and the menstrual cycle.
Wow.
And what happens in indigenous practices is that there's sort of this encouragement to not use psilocybin when you're on your period or
Mhm.
about to get it. And she recommends, if you're going to do like a macro dose, to do that closer to ovulation. And
Oh,
this
okay.
makes sense from a scientific standpoint as well, because based on the way the hormones are interacting during that time, at ovulation, you have more energy available to you. You feel more
Mhm.
vitality at ovulation. Whereas as you get in that late luteal phase where you're about to get your period, our energy kind of crashes and we feel a little sluggish and fatigued and things like that. And psilocybin can also be even though it can be really wonderful, it can also be draining on the body to do a journey, on the mind too.
Yeah.
And so it makes sense to do it a little closer to ovulation. And part of that has to also do, like, the fatigue that we feel in the luteal phase also has to do with the way that our bodies are managing glucose and insulin, or, just
Mhm.
how we're
Oh,
handling
I
nutrients.
yeah. Oh, well,
Go ahead.
I just have to say, so I have PCOS
Oh, yeah.
and
Okay.
struggled with just consistent periods and regular periods, and conceiving, and had
I'm
some early miscarriages
so sorry.
um, and a late one. It was. I have a beautiful daughter right now who's a
Good.
miracle and just amazing. But I believe, with PCOS, a big issue, well, I tend to pretend I'm my own doctor sometimes, but it was this borderline, blood sugar,
Mhm.
what do we call that? Intolerance?
Insulin resistance. You have,
Insulin, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
so there's a huge you're correct. You There's a huge link between insulin resistance and polycystic ovary syndrome, and
Mm,
that has to do with if insulin resistance is present, your ovaries end up producing more androgens.
mhm.
And we're not really sure through research yet, like, is it because someone has just become insulin resistant that they develop PCOS, or is it that there's some sort of issue going on already that makes you predisposed to insulin resistance? And then that causes the PCOS, or we just don't know the chicken and the egg scenario quite
Absolutely,
yet
yeah.
with that.
I
But
just
there,
to kind of circle back though quickly, but,
yeah,
at the time, I worked through it, with my doctor, and we conceived healthy,
I'm
and,
so glad to hear
um
that.
but I do believe that over time, when I started microdosing and using psilocybin consistently and intentionally, it changed my eating patterns and mental
Yeah.
thought loops around food and negative, um, self concept, which in turn changed that, I'm gonna say it wrong again, glucose
Insulin resistance, yeah.
insulin resistance,
Right,
um,
absolutely.
over time, and then, here I am, I'm at mid-40s, and for once, finally having consistent regular periods. I'm sure not for long, but,
Right.
um, yes,
Perimenopause.
I just wanted to share. Sorry. I know
Yeah,
you're
no,
in
I
a
appreciate that you shared your personal experience with that because so many people are struggling with polycystic ovary syndrome or things like endometriosis, which is something I have.
mm,
And yeah, like understanding the mechanisms behind that is really important because that helps us know how do we manage our issues going forward and how does it what's actually going on in the body. And you raise a really important point in that you were talking about how microdosing and using psilocybin pretty regularly helped you sort of rework some thought patterns that you had around food, maybe, and then just leaning into certain behavior changes. And I think psilocybin can be an incredible tool for that just because of how it interacts with the brain. It helps us change behaviors if we want to change them or change negative thought patterns. So we're
mm,
seeing it studied for things like eating disorders and stuff
mhm,
like that, which is really exciting. And I see a
mhm.
lot of promise there.
I love that, and I know I was gonna ask, you were talking about when you did reach out and meet with, a Native American or indigenous,
Yeah.
person too. Did they involve conversation around the moon and cycle?
He didn't bring up the moon or cycles really at all. He is an indigenous practitioner and really wonderful, but he was more focused on like the ceremonial practices surrounding psilocybin and making sure that like that set me up for the best experience possible in terms of preparing me for the journey and then what to expect during it and then what comes after and making sure that I was working to integrate my experience over time and stuff like that. So it was less about like
I see.
the moon or the cycle or anything like that, and more just rooted in some of those indigenous practices surrounding what's called set and setting. Set
Mm,
being the mindset that you go into a journey with, and then setting being like what's actually around you physically and who's around you and how are you feeling, everything like that.
wow, it's so interesting to, well, I'm gonna keep it in the back of my mind that, larger doses will go well with, ovulation.
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah.
um, and yeah, I couldn't help but bring up the moon. I was in ceremony in Costa Rica in the jungle, in the temple under a full moon, and
Wow.
was bleeding, because I think it heightens, or it did bring on, my bleed, and
Mhm.
it's just, who knows? All of those elements are so powerful.
Really is,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely.
Alrighty, let's see here. I was gonna get into, so yeah, we kind of did cover where, does it matter where and when and how we're using psilocybin with our cycle. So we just touched on a larger dose seems to kind of work well during the, ovulation phase. Is
Yeah.
there, um, when you're writing this handbook and talking about psilocybin, are you talking about kind of full spectrum working with the medicine from low dose to large doses?
Yeah, so, a lot of times the writing is relating to larger doses, but I do have topics related to microdosing as well. So with microdosing and the menstrual cycle, what my indigenous wisdom expert said is that if you're going to microdose for, like, to see how it affects your menstrual cycle, and that sort of thing, or for a condition related to your menstrual cycle, it's a good idea to, try whatever protocol you're going to try because there are many protocols out there.
Mm,
But two of the popular ones are Stamets Stack and the Fadiman protocol. And what she was saying is that choose whatever protocol you're going to do, follow that for 3 months. So over the course of what would be 3 cycles, because it can take that long to sort of
mm,
gauge how you're feeling and how it's working for you. So it's a good idea to do that for 3 months and maybe take a journal or an app and just sort of log your experience? Is your mood changing? What are your symptoms related to a condition or your menstrual cycle in general? Is it changing as a result of microdosing? And if for some reason it's not helping or not working, I mean, you could either choose to stop or try a different protocol, that sort of thing. And so I thought that
Mhm.
was really good advice too. But I think it matters less in terms of where you are in your cycle when you're microdosing. Although I'm hoping that we get to a level of research that helps us really dial that in, and that we do end up creating microdosing protocols that actually are aligned with our cycles in some way. So I'm pushing for
Wouldn't
that
that be
sort of thing to happen.
fantastic?
Yeah,
Yeah.
because most of these protocols have been created by men and focus. I mean, nothing wrong with that. It's just more that they're focused. They're not thinking about the menstrual cycle in relation to that. So
Right. Well, yeah. So I'm curious, you suffered from endometriosis,
endometriosis, yeah, it's a
and
mouthful.
were you was this something psilocybin helped you with, or you tell
It's
me more?
interesting. So yeah, I have endometriosis, and I ended up in, I guess it was 2017, no, 2016, the end of 2016. I had a hysterectomy, so
Oh, wow.
removal of my uterus, and I got rid of I got rid of one. I axed one ovary, the other ovary is still there, but I kept the ovaries. So I wouldn't immediately go into or menopause.
Mhm.
Essentially, would be what that would be, is medical menopause. But I have noticed that like some benefits from psilocybin related to endometriosis. So in addition to having endometriosis, I get menstrual migraine related to that. And
Mm,
so even though I don't have a period anymore, I still have a cycle going on kind of like quietly in my body because I just don't have the visual of the blood. I don't have a uterus anymore, but I still have a cycle because I have an ovary. And
sure.
so I do still have some cyclical pain related to endometriosis and then also the menstrual migraine. And it actually completely eliminated my migraines for 6 months, which has never happened to me before. So that
Wow.
was an amazing thing. Like again, I can't be certain that that was related to psilocybin, but I have no other explanation for why suddenly I would have an absence of menstrual migraine. And then
I
with oh, go
oh,
ahead.
I'm just curious. I mean, it makes me wonder because with psilocybin, I decades ago used recreationally, always
Mhm.
with alcohol. And then I got really specific about my intentions, especially when I was trying to quit drinking alcohol. And,
Sure.
my intention literally was like, help me to feel normal today without alcohol. I'm wondering, like, if there's any sort of you actively know, endometriosis is
Endometriosis, yeah.
with the migraines and it's part of me, if you're a mushroom believer, it's like, I if your intention is to, get some relief, and it's hard not to see that as, helping you to feel better.
Yeah, right. There's usually some sort of potential there. And what I came across in research related to endometriosis and psilocybin was really interesting. So there's no research out there like actually looking at how does psilocybin affect endometriosis. Maybe
Yeah.
one day we'll have that, but
Mhm.
little baby steps.
Right.
But what I did find that was really fascinating was there's this study out there where scientists took 4 psilocybin extracts and they placed it on human cells in a lab. So this was not done on people, it was just done in a lab. But what they found was that the psilocybin extracts reduced the expression of certain inflammatory molecules on the cells. And
Mm,
what was fascinating about that was that it was the same molecules that are exacerbated or like overexpressed when endometriosis is present. So
mm,
endometriosis is when you have sort of tissue that mimics the lining of the endometrium. That tissue that's mimicking the lining of the uterus is outside of the uterus. It's in different locations throughout the pelvis. It can really actually go anywhere in the body. People have found endometriosis in the brain, in the lungs, that sort of thing. And but when you have that issue going on, it's like you have all of these lesions is what they're called when they're elsewhere in the body, and they like they send out a bunch of inflammatory molecules and just create a lot of inflammation in the body, and that can drive a lot of pain. And
Mm.
so again, what these researchers were doing, they weren't looking at endometriosis specifically, but it did reduce the expression of certain inflammatory molecules that are implicated in endometriosis. So
Oh.
I could certainly see down the road, after more research and application, for like microdosing as a way of keeping inflammation at bay and
Mm.
then potentially resolving, or at least helping alleviate some of the endometriosis symptoms, which pain is a big component of that, of course.
Amazing. Yeah, I know many people that have suffered, and um, yeah, I guess kind of turn it. Do you? What are your thoughts? I know there's probably not a lot of studies or research, but just in general with perimenopause and using psilocybin, I get
Oh,
asked all
yeah.
the time, and my answer is always just, "Of course." I
Yeah,
don't.
of
Yeah.
course. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I'd love to pick your brain on it and, hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think there are 4 ways that psilocybin is beneficial in perimenopause, and what I like to how I like to present it is that I think it's a really great idea if people are interested in to do a macro dose, because I think that the benefits really come from that. And then after the macro dose, engaging in some microdosing going forward as a way to reconnect yourself to that journey that you had. So I
Love
just
that.
wanted to preface that before I dig into my menopause spiel, which I have a whole thing on. So yeah, I have like 4 ways that I think that psilocybin can be helpful in perimenopause, and one is perimenopausal related depression and anxiety. So I'll talk about that first. Then female sexual dysfunction, which is really prevalent during perimenopause and menopause and beyond. And then dealing with trauma. So if you've had, it sounds crazy, but if you've had trauma in your life, you are more likely to have worse menopause symptoms. That seems really unfair, but that's what research has uncovered. And then the final thing, that in relation to how I think psilocybin can help with perimenopause, is leaning into behavior change, which you were talking about just briefly earlier. So I'll cover those 4 things, and feel free to interrupt me if you as I dig into my spiel. But
Let's go for
the
it.
first thing is depression. So, even if you have never really had depression or anxiety before, the hormonal changes that happen during perimenopause can bring on new depression or worsening depression. Same thing with anxiety, and perimenopause, by the way, can last like up to 14 years. So you typically, people end up in it in their mid 40s, although it can happen earlier, even in as early as your 30s. And it can menopause, the average age of menopause is like 51, 52, and that's when you've just had an absence of a period for a year. After
Mm.
that, like, you're basically in postmenopause like right away.
Okay.
So that trajectory can be a long time, which can be complicated if you're dealing with new depression and anxiety, plus dealing with all these different life changes, not just with what's going on in your body, but midlife can bring on so many life changes, whether you're sending kids off to school, like to college and becoming an empty nester, or maybe you're still raising small children. Maybe you're also caring for aging parents or your spouse's parents, whatever it might be. It's a lot to take on at the same time when you're going through all of these changes. So
Mm.
again, depression might come on, and the first thing that would happen if you go to your doctor and say, "Hey, I'm having the sudden onset of depression, or like sudden onset of worsening depression, and you're in perimenopause," they're going to just relate it to perimenopause and say, "Hey, you should take an antidepressant," right? And there's nothing wrong with antidepressants. I advocate for them when people need them, and I think that they can be a really great tool. I've used them before in the past, but I do have a concern with taking an antidepressant without thinking about other ways to work on the depression or the anxiety or mitigate it. Sometimes those medications are absolutely necessary, so I never want to say that they're not. Go ahead.
Quick question. So
Yeah,
I know that they do tend to hand out the antidepressants like candy.
yeah.
Um,
They're just like,
how about some of these hormone therapies?
oh
Um,
yes,
how what
that's
are
a
your
great question.
What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, okay, we'll dig into that first. So I'm a huge advocate for hormone replacement therapy if you're a candidate for it, but not everyone is a candidate for it. But it does offer a lot of benefits in terms of mitigating symptoms, including depression, including hot flashes, weight gain associated with perimenopause, all of that. Not that I want to focus on like bodies, but it's in terms of like how we look, but that can
Mhm.
impact your self-esteem and be frustrating. And so that's a real concern for people in perimenopause. So HRT is really great for all of those things. Plus, it offers some protection. So we become more at risk for insulin resistance as we go through perimenopause because we lose
Oh.
estrogen. And so then that puts us more at risk for your diabetes, type 2 diabetes,
Mm.
pre-diabetes, things like that. And it can also increase our risk for dementia. So HRT is really, I think, beneficial for all of those things. And I'm a huge advocate for that. However, I'm personally not a candidate. I can't take any hormone replacement therapy. And that's all individual per person. So I don't want you to use my experiences to guide
Mhm.
yours. But I had a blood clot in my arm
Mm.
related to taking hormonal birth control when I was in my 30s. And so I can't use HRT. And
Okay.
even though they've investigated, like, could I use a patch? Because that in some cases people can, but my doctors are like, absolutely not. You're just too much of a risk. And
You're
so
you're
none
just
for
meant
me.
to have the mushrooms, okay?
Yeah, so I've been joking about that. I'm actually writing a new book
Oh, good.
about menopause and how do you manage it without HRT.
Mm.
And psilocybin will be a big topic of that book. But going back to just talking a little bit about that depression aspect. So of course, SSRIs, like these are the common antidepressants that are out there. They're very useful to treat depression. But what they do, how they operate, is that they blunt your mood. So, and that's the
Mm.
goal, right? They blunt your lows, but not only do they blunt that, they blunt your highs too. And so, this is where my concern comes in: is that, or at least one of them with SSRIs, is that this is a time when I think we need to be leaning into our joys as much as possible when you're going through perimenopause. And so,
Mm.
if that's blunted, I think that that can sometimes exacerbate depression or just make you feel really flat, you know? And what
Yeah.
we've learned through research on psilocybin is that instead of blunting your mood, it actually makes you feel more okay with both your highs. Obviously we feel
Mhm.
really great when we're experiencing a joy, but it also makes you feel more okay with when you're feeling
Mm.
down. And I know depression is not just about feeling down, it's very much more involved than that. But what we've learned from psilocybin through research as well, so again, that information about it not blunting your mood comes from research. And then also what we know about psilocybin is that it's not something that you have to take regularly. So of course, doing a macro dose, it's not like you're doing a macro dose every day or we wouldn't get any work done. I mean, I'd like to, but
Wow.
I wouldn't get anything else done, right?
Mhm.
So you can't macrodose regularly, or you would build up a tolerance to it, and it
Sure.
would be
Yeah.
very conducive to normal life. So people are macrodosing maybe a few times a year or once a year, and we know through research that psilocybin has a lasting effect on depression, and the different studies cite different timelines in terms of, is
Mhm.
it 6 months, is it five
Mhm.
years? It ranges excessively in terms of whichever study you look at, but we do know it has an enduring effect on depression as long as you're doing that work related to like integration and learning from your
Mm.
experience and leaning into the behavior change aspects of things. All of that is really important.
Mm.
But so I see some benefits to turning to psilocybin rather than just automatically taking an SSRI just because your doctor is like, hey, here's a prescription for that. And again, I don't want to sway people one way or the
Yeah.
other. I'm just raising the concern.
It's good to have options, right? And
Yeah.
I mean, some more legal than others, but
Yeah,
I
of
think,
course.
this is what this show is all about, is just normalizing conversation around responsible and safe use.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. Should I keep going on my menopause
Yeah, well,
spiel? Okay,
I
go
know, and
ahead.
then because we're on there's 4, so
Yeah,
I
so
just wanna make
we just
sure.
covered the first one.
Okay,
There was one more thing I wanted to
yeah,
say, which will about depression, but it'll also lead us into the next conversation. So one of the related to menopause. So one of the issues that also can crop up in perimenopause is female sexual dysfunction. So that can mean many things from like low libido, inability to orgasm, pain with intercourse, vaginal dryness. These are all factors that can be part of female sexual dysfunction. And with the female body, you're already more at risk for female sexual dysfunction. We have about so if you're premenopausal, so like before you've entered perimenopause in your reproductive years, you're really about people are there's a 40% prevalence of female sexual dysfunction just in people in their reproductive years.
wow,
Once you get into perimenopause and beyond, that goes up to like 85% of people are experiencing female sexual dysfunction or some form of it. One of the risk factor or one of the side effects of taking an antidepressant, certain antidepressants, is that it can really tank your libido or cause even more sexual dysfunction. And so I think that's a huge concern too, because sex is incredibly important. Having a healthy, like just sexuality is important to
and
people, and
building
it's
our creative
yeah,
force, and there's no
absolutely.
time to not feel good about it.
And it's just been prioritized in the male body, of course,
Yes,
but
of
I
course.
digress.
Yeah.
But, digging into that, I do think psilocybin can be beneficial for, your sex life, and so people have asked about this, a little bit in relation to perimenopause, and so I'll dig into that. There are two things that can be somewhat protective against female sexual dysfunction, and these are not guarantees, but they have benefits. One is having really good intimate partner communication.
Mm,
Easier said than done, but psilocybin can help us get there, and I'll dig into that in a second. The other thing is that psilocybin can help, or one of the things that's protective against female sexual dysfunction is having a positive body image. Also
mm,
easier said than done, especially in perimenopause, but we have learned that psilocybin has shown promise for helping with eating disorders. And when an eating disorder is present, or when we have a negative body image, there's something going on in a part of the brain called the angular gyrus, and that's just there. We're just getting some rigidity in there in terms of like really negative thought patterns and bodily awareness and things like that. And so we've seen that psilocybin through research can relax that rigidity. Go ahead.
can you say the name of that again?
So it's in the angular gyrus, and I
Angular,
don't
okay.
exactly know a whole lot about the angular gyrus. I just know
Just
that it's
curious.
involved.
Okay.
It's involved in eating disorders and that rigidity of body image. And so we see some promise there with psilocybin. We're actually studying that's being studied for like anorexia, things like
Mhm.
that. Now, going back to that idea of psilocybin helping with intimate partner communication, so, what I mean by that is that psilocybin can help foster connection. Now, of course, you could use psilocybin with your partner, and it doesn't mean you have to be having sex or anything like that, but
Mm,
it could foster some more intimate communication between you two if that is the case, if you're missing that.
mm,
But you don't necessarily have to do psilocybin together to make that happen, which is
mm.
sort of fascinating, right?
Yeah.
You can just go off, do your own journey, and then return, and you might have a different connection to your partner, which just makes it
Mm.
just so amazing. There's something that
Absolutely.
happens when you're on psilocybin that's called that the researchers have used this term called oceanic boundlessness, which is kind of a beautiful
Mm.
term, but it's a term that comes from a conversation between Sigmund Freud, and he was communicating with some French mystic or something like that, and they coined the term oceanic boundlessness to describe like mystical experience of feeling like
Mm.
connection to the universe at
Oh, I
large or
love
to
that.
nature. Such a beautiful term, right? But so they weren't talking about psilocybin when they coined this term, but now researchers related to
Yeah.
doing psychedelic research have brought that term into the conversation, because there is some truth to that. There we have that we you can have this expanded sense of connection to people, and just relating it back to my own experience, my own journey, one of the ways that I experienced that oceanic boundlessness was essentially feeling like I was connected to by threads of light to everyone that I know and love and who
Oh,
loves me back. It was really a quite beautiful feeling because in our lives, we tend to know we have a support system out there, but to really feel it in your body is something that was incredibly profound for me. And I went off and did my own journey with a guide, and I came back, and I've been married to my husband at the time. I'd been married to my husband for 10 years. I love the guy, but I came back and I was like, I really like this guy a lot, sort of
wow.
laughing at myself, like, oh, okay, I do really love this guy. Not that I was questioning it, but it was just like
No,
this
but
expanse. And
yeah,
it did change our communication. And he didn't do anything different. It was all
that's
me. And I
yeah.
think sometimes we put up these walls or we put up these blocks, and that can
Mm,
affect our sex lives. And I wasn't necessarily having
absolutely.
sexual dysfunction related to that, but I do feel like it changed our relationship for the better. And again, he didn't do anything. So I just always want to bring that up
That
to people that it could be beneficial for your interpersonal relationships, including those romantic ones. Go ahead. It sounds
yeah.
like you
No,
say something.
I just, one of the number one questions I tend to get with this podcast involves using psychedelics for sex or boosting sex
Yeah.
life. So thank you for sharing. And I would like to just interject as a single woman who doesn't drink alcohol. Um, I feel like not only well, my favorite, I love a gram and then the bedroom. But even on the dating scene,
Sure.
just feeling like the medicine is there to help me feel confident in my communication and more authentic and myself, right? And
Yes.
and I feel like that can carry over when you're being intimate with somebody and just being more yourself
Definitely.
and just, all the senses are heightened and yeah, so conversation, communication. This is why I encourage not the sex part, but for small teams
Right.
to to
What are you advocating for? No, I'm kidding.
the boardroom, the board no.
Sign me up. No, I'm kidding.
Hey, okay, well, let's talk off camera.
Okay.
No.
Right.
But you know what I'm saying? I feel like, or the idea of, let's say you work in a restaurant together or some sort of team and, it's like working real time, but then also behind the scenes, because I truly believe the medicine works before, during, and after and creates the oceanic, say it again.
Oceanic boundlessness. You got
Yes,
it.
cool. Well, I love
Yeah.
yeah, it's such an interesting, conversation, when yeah, a lot of people are curious, so thank you for broaching that.
Yeah, you're welcome. And just to add on to that, like I use cannabis for that exact reason as
Mm,
well. I think it just takes away some of the sort of subconscious inhibitions that we have, and
yeah,
I find that that is very useful for me.
so much better
Um,
than a hangover,
yeah. Oh, yes. No hangover there. So that
and
makes
then
me
you
feel
can
really
remember all of the
yeah.
things.
Yes. Exactly.
Yes.
So yeah,
Uh,
continuing the perimenopause discussion. So the next thing I was going to talk about was trauma. So if you have a history of trauma, so anything, especially childhood trauma. So in scientific literature, they call these things ACEs, which stands for adverse childhood experiences. And
mm,
to put this into perspective, like so many of us have had ACEs. It's 1 in 6 adults has had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, and these could be anything related that caused trauma in childhood. And that could be something like the obvious things like sexual abuse or just physical abuse and neglect. Living in like in a situation where you're experiencing systemic racism in your community. If you live through extreme poverty as a child, having a parent that's incarcerated, having your parents go through like this really extremely volatile divorce, a lot of conflict in your home, living through a natural disaster or a man-made one. I mean, there are so many things that can be
mhm.
an adverse childhood experience. For me, one of my key ones, I had a lot of childhood illness where I was like in the ICU and stuff. And so
Oh,
that was really traumatic for me. And I didn't really connect the dots and that, yeah, I experienced some serious trauma as a kid because
mhm.
of that. But what we've learned through research is that if you've had 4 or more ACEs, you are more likely to have worse menopause symptoms. And so, I mean, I think that could relate to even if you've had fewer than 4. But
Mhm.
essentially, what the research is showing is that there's a connection to childhood trauma and then worse menopause symptoms, which seems really weird. Like, how is that possible? It also seems really unfair. You've had trauma. Now, hey, welcome to hot flashes.
Yeah.
Yay. That seems unfair. But the reason that this might happen is because we know for certain that when you have an adverse childhood experience, of course, we think of children as really resilient, but it physically changes their stress response along that hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Like, it makes it more heightened. And so you can end up in this what's called a state of hypervigilance, where you are perceiving that everything, even in everyday life, is a threat, right? And so you're just
Mm,
always anxious and nervous.
mm,
Whereas if you have sort of a more regulated stress response, you're able to turn off that fight or flight when it crops up, and you can switch over to what's called your rest and digest mode. So we have fight or flight, where we're like heart rate's racing, blood pressure goes up, and you're hot and sweaty. And then
mhm.
you have rest and digest, where you're really calm and your body is like engaging in all of its normal functions, like digestion. Whereas when fight or flight switches on, digestion halts because your body is putting all energy towards you,
Mm.
escaping a
Surviving.
risk, right?
Yeah,
Or like a
yeah,
threat, right?
yeah.
So again, these adverse childhood experiences actually change your stress response and make it harder for you to flip from fight or flight to rest and digest. A lot
Mm,
of us have coping mechanisms where, like, at the start of our podcast, we both took a deep breath, right? And
mhm,
then that's a way to get back into rest and digest mode. But not everyone is able to just do that in it with that switch, right?
mhm,
And so, a lot of our menopausal symptoms are related to that fight or flight response because some of those things are happening in the hypothalamus. For example, the hypothalamus controls our body temperature. And so when we reach menopause and we're having some hormonal shifts, the hypothalamus is normally able to like adjust temperature without any bodily reaction. But that can change in perimenopause because of hormonal changes, and it makes the hypothalamus sort of overreact if you like change 1 degree in temperature or something like that. Like, if you're giving a talk and then you get really hot, and that's my way of getting hot flashes. I'm like
wow.
speaking publicly or something,
Yeah.
and then I'm like, oh gosh. But that trauma from childhood can ratchet that up even more, is what we're
Mm,
learning. So you might be more getting even worse hot flashes or more frequent hot flashes from that trauma embedded in your body. Now, what we do know with psilocybin is that we know this through research, that psilocybin actually reduces that psychological response to our ACEs, to our adverse childhood experiences.
yes.
So we've learned that through research recently. And so that is very promising. And so I think psilocybin is something that we can use as a tool at any point in our lives to reprocess trauma, because we've learned that it helps us do that in a few different ways. One, that I'll just mention briefly, is that there's something called fear extinction when you're on psilocybin. And
Mm,
so our fear center is our like amygdala, and it's just really reactionary. And so in a normal state of consciousness, we tend to avoid thinking about our trauma because it's so triggering and it causes a lot of anxiety and things like that. So it's normal for us to be like, I don't want to think about that.
mhm,
When you are on psilocybin, that those same triggers or fears that you associate with your trauma go away, kind of. And
mm,
that's what I mean
mhm,
by fear extinction. So trauma may come up for you during a journey. It's very likely to come up for you, but you won't have that same association of fear, and you can then look at your trauma in a new way,
mm,
reprocess it, and then on the other side of your journey, then you do some integration related to that experience. And it tends to, I mean, I guess there's no guarantees, but of course it tends to, through research we've learned, help resolve or at least reduce that trauma response. So it could be a way, theoretically, to help you address trauma, which then may help you mitigate that heightened stress response that's involved in some of those perimenopause symptoms, which is just
yeah.
fascinating.
That is so fascinating, and I so appreciate you pointing that out. I think that, um, yeah, I couldn't agree. I mean, I was going to state a lot of people that I work with, I think their biggest fear is that sitting with a large dose of psilocybin is going to bring back these exact,
Oh yeah.
horror stories. And although it may feel everybody has their own experiences, right? For me, I feel like again, it illuminates and there's work. You have to sit and you have to feel,
Me too.
but you feel held, or you feel, I used to feel a lot of shame, and a lot of it to do with drinking, but and then just had this negative self thought pattern
Sure.
24/7 around it, right? And I all I can say is the medicine. It's just you get access, but you feel guided, or
Yeah.
yeah. But I think that people are very specifically, a lot of the fear, and especially doing something that you've never done, and knowing that the medicine's going to illuminate, and we've got to see dark sometimes to see the light.
Yes.
Yes, I just wanted to touch on that.
No,
That's
I'm
all.
glad you did, and I can share just a brief personal experience related to that and related to
Love
my
to.
first psilocybin journey. So I, at one point during the journey, felt that like that trauma response coming on because my brain was taking me somewhere I did not want to go. And
Mm.
I felt that heightened sense of like anxiety and like I want to unsubscribe from this experience, like control alt delete, right? But you
Yes.
can't, like you have to
Mm.
sit with it. You're all already on the ride of the carnival and you're going to have to sit with it. But it's natural for at first when that starts to come up for you to be like, oh my gosh, absolutely not, get me off this ride,
Mhm.
because you're used to feeling so triggered by thinking about your trauma. But if you can just remember that that fear extinction will be present, that initially when it comes up for you, you might sense some resistance, but if
Mhm.
you can remind yourself to sit with it and relax into it and let it unfold, that you will be able to look at your trauma in a new way. And
Oh
on the
yeah.
other side of that is like intense, I think, peace and euphoria. So for me, the thing that was coming up at the time and that had been really giving me a lot of anxiety is that I do care for aging parents. And I had this like really erroneous concept in my brain that that when they pass away, I'm just going to have like a dark life. Like there's no, I'll just have unending grief related to that and I'll
Mm.
never be happy again. Like that was like a, it's not a realistic scenario,
Mm.
right? But my brain was not willing to accept any other thing. And so I had this anxiety surrounding this
Mhm.
caregiving and then losing my parents. So that started to come up for me during my journey. And again, I was like, okay, get me out of here. But I reminded myself to sit with it. And I was able to see that this is an erroneous thought pattern
Mhm.
and use actual logic in my brain to retrain my brain through that
Mhm.
concept. And then on the other side of that sort of intense, I would say it was an intense like 5 to 10 minutes. It's hard to put my finger on it because time starts to like go crazy when you're on
Mhm.
psilocybin.
Mhm.
But it wasn't very long. But I had this like sense of like, oh gosh. And then I sat with it. And on the other side of just thinking about it for 5 or 10 minutes, I felt the most peace and euphoria I've ever felt in my life.
Love
And
that.
ever since then, even though I'm still dealing with like, I'm caring for aging parents and worried about them, I can always tap back into that feeling of like, okay, no, you have to use logic in your brain and you're going to be okay on the other side of this,
Mm.
even if it's traumatic and hard.
Mhm.
You've been through difficult things in the past, you have a support system, you're not going through it
Mhm.
alone, that sort of thing. So that's just an example how you can sort of retrain your brain related to I mean that wasn't necessarily trauma, but I do feel that is traumatic in my body because it's
Oh yeah.
brings me so much anxiety. So
When you had your experience, you were with a guide? or were you
I
solo?
was, yeah. So my guide was there, and my trips, and he also brought a female trip sitter with him, so
Oh,
that I would
wow.
feel very safe, because that's
Yeah.
also another whole like safety aspect for, especially for women.
Mhm,
But yeah, so I had both of them in the room. They were not interfering with me though.
mhm,
They let me have that experience. They were
mhm.
there to let me know I was safe, but they
Sure.
just kind of held back in terms of like she has to navigate this herself. So what I
Yeah.
was doing was like I was sitting on a couch, and the couch was like, I didn't like this very much, but it was like breathing.
Oh my
You
gosh.
know,
Yeah.
Judith
Yeah.
had that experience. I was like, you're not supposed to breathe, couch. But and again, this anxiety was coming up. So I just kept looking at my guide, and he would just kind of nod, and I felt safe. It was just more like I've got to go through this on my own.
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more. I now have learned that I can incorporate, just some breath work or if it gets to that point, but absolutely there is always this, the come up of anxiety of what's going to be illuminated and how. But
Right.
then when you have these insights or, little tiny breakthroughs, you're rewarded because even like your situation where you're feeling this erroneous about your parents going and to some people that might just seem like, oh, not a problem. But obviously it was holding you back and the medicine needed to show you that this,
Yeah.
and so it's just so special. I love to hear it. Thank you for that
It
example.
really is. Yeah, absolutely. So my final thing on perimenopause, and then we'll
Yes.
switch to whatever you want to talk about, was behavior change. And so you were talking a little bit about, leaning into some behavior change after using psilocybin. And there is a reason why this is beneficial. So a lot of times in perimenopause, we're starting to recognize that we have negative thought patterns, or maybe we're wanting to engage in different habits. You mentioned like drinking and things like that. There's a lot of people in perimenopause who are trying to abstain from drinking, but they keep falling into the same old patterns. Or it might be other addictions like online shopping, just to throw out a random one. I mean,
Mhm,
there are so many different things that we can use that we numb ourselves out with, instead of
mhm,
really just grappling with our emotions when we need to. And so, why would psilocybin help us make behavior changes? Which I think this is really fascinating. So, when we are in adulthood, our brains become really rigid and our beliefs are really solidified, and it's
mm,
hard to change your mind. And this is happening because, so when we are children, we haven't formed our identities yet, and we haven't figured out how the world around us operates. So our minds are super flexible until we start to form those things. We start to learn about ourselves and how the world around us operates over time. And when we get into adulthood, that becomes really, really rigid. And it's really hard to change those thought patterns that get ingrained in us. So, researchers have come up with a model to describe what's happening when you're on a psychedelic. And this is called the Rebus model, REBUS, and it
mhm.
stands for Relaxed Beliefs Under Psychedelics. So,
Okay.
they kind of describe it this way in a beautiful analogy where if you think about your brain in adulthood, when you're just in a normal state of consciousness, think of it as like a pond that has been frozen over. So it's no longer water, it's ice.
Mm,
And if you were to try to take a new belief, let's say you're trying to change a negative belief about yourself, like maybe your body image or just
mhm,
whatever it is, if you were to try to take that new belief and drop it into a frozen pond, nothing happens, right? It just sits on top, maybe goes thunk, might cause a crack, but not much happens.
mhm,
If you think about your mind on a psychedelic, then, and now we think about that as having you've got a thawed pond, you've actually got water again. You take a new belief,
mhm,
drop it in, and it gains entry, and it causes a little bit of a ripple effect.
mm,
And so, like, why does this happen when you're on a psychedelic? It's really interesting because in our normal states of consciousness, our minds form what's called this belief hierarchy. So I like to relate it to think about a corporation, right? At a corporation, you have like all the CEOs at the top, and then you've got the lesser known employees kind of at the bottom. And the CEOs don't really want to listen to like the
mm-mm,
newbie beliefs, right? They're like, oh, whatever, you're just an intern, get out of here. Right?
mhm,
And so when we're on a psychedelic, that belief hierarchy goes away. So the interns and the CEOs are just all on the same level, which might give you a chance to get that intern to climb up the ladder, right? So it's a really great way of thinking about if you are trying to change your mind about something and lean into a new behavior, whether that's
Mm.
like, hey, I want to start doing more strength training to gain muscle to help me through perimenopause, or I want to stop drinking so much or altogether, or I want to like, um, I'm deciding I need to make some changes in my life, whatever they may be. Psilocybin can be a really great tool to do that. And part of what's happening there, not only are we having that like relaxing of that hierarchy, you also have a lot of neuroplasticity going on in your brain. So that means you're growing new synapses and dendrites. It's just kind of like your brain is flowering, right?
Mhm.
And that has some lasting effects too. It's not super long, but we're looking at anywhere from like 3 to 6 months where you have this increased level of neuroplasticity, which is also a really great time to lean into that behavior change. So after you're done with your journey and you start that process of integrating what you learned from your journey, that time period is still your brain is still very neuroplastic and flexible, and you're
Critical learning
able,
period, do we
yeah,
call it?
critical learning period, which is just super cool to me.
Mm.
So it helps you really kind of, make those behavior changes. One other there's a therapist, her name is Gwen Pelfini, and she described it like this too, where if you think about a ski slope, right? If you think about just any sort of like ski resort, and the skiers kind of go down the same paths, right, all
Mhm.
the time. We do that with our thought patterns and beliefs, right? We just keep following the same behaviors that we've always done as coping mechanisms because that's what we're used to. And
Mhm.
if you think about psilocybin, it's like psilocybin comes in with a snow machine and like
Mm.
it grooms all the paths, and now you have these fresh new ski slopes, and you can pick which path or way you're going to go down. It's
Mm.
no longer in the same old ski ruts. And
Absolutely.
yeah, I love that metaphor or
Fresh
analogy.
powder, me too.
Yeah, fresh powder.
Yeah. And I think, just along these lines, I've been using psilocybin, I don't know, 4 years intentionally now, and I just am learning about when I do have these larger dose experiences or, anything breakthrough like, to microdose and continue to, like you said
Yes.
earlier, kind of like keep these threads, um, to embody or help, remember essence and feelings of the trip and the journey. So I really like to just reinforce that idea, to reinforce these important journeys that we're having.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that is a key thing about microdosing is that it kind of keeps you connected to what did you learn in your macro dose. I mean, microdosing can be a great tool on its own without macrodosing, but I think
Mhm.
it's also a really great thing to continue after you've finished you've done your macrodose and you just want to reconnect to your experience and continue with that integration process.
Absolutely. I'm just taking a look here. I don't think we've touched, or have we touched on the entourage effect? What?
Oh, we haven't yet. So yeah, so like the entourage effect is this idea of, I mean, we can relate it to sort of any substance in cannabis. It's the concept of like, does THC work better for people when it's also combined with CBD, right? So
Mhm.
when you're using like all these plant compounds from the cannabis plant, do they work better together? And there's some research to suggest that that's the case. In terms of psilocybin, of course, we're just dealing with the substance, but does psilocybin have some interaction with our female hormones? And it
Mm.
sounds like it does. And we're still learning all the nuances related to that. We do know that estrogen affects the way that psilocybin would bind at the serotonin receptor site. So when you ingest psilocybin, it turns into psilocin in your body, and then that attaches to your serotonin receptors and activates them. Right,
Mhm.
it binds to them and activates them. And we know that estrogen affects the binding at that site. We just
Mhm.
don't know all the ways that this or what ramifications that has. Is it good? Is it bad? We don't know yet. And so I'm hoping that through additional research, we start to learn that, which would then help us craft more of a timeline on when it's best in your cycle to use psilocybin, Or if we're using something like HRT during perimenopause, does that dose of HRT affect it? And is it good? Is it bad? We just don't
Mm.
really have all the answers to that yet, but I'm hoping that we figured that out. But that's what's meant by the entourage effect.
Okay,
And
gotcha.
there's some concepts related to that too, with taking a certain strain of psilocybin. Like there are all these different strains, and so it might be that like if you take golden teacher with penis envy, just to throw out just a random thing. It might be that like if you combine different strains, that it leads to different effects. And so people are of course experimenting with this, but we just don't have all the answers to that yet.
Yeah, I've been doing a little experimenting. Not That's why I have worked with some blends of different strains with psilocybin, but most recently I was introduced to Blue Lotus,
Hmm.
which is an Egyptian lily, and it's not a Schedule One substance. I mean, it's
Oh.
and um, I had Blue Lotus on its own. It was in a tea,
Hmm.
and I felt, very different from psilocybin, but what it did is it completely turned down my mind. Like, I
Hmm.
felt like I was floating in water in heaven. It was
Well, that
absolutely
sounds nice.
phenomenal, and I mean, I wasn't hallucinating. It was just this, like, amazing full body calm feeling. And then I got to thinking, this would be beautiful to have on, before consuming some mushrooms, especially if there's some anxiety um,
Yeah.
but I love the thought, if I'm having a journey, I like to kind of land back having some cannabis. I feel that a lot of these plants work well together. And of
I do
course,
too.
it's important to know before we go crazy. But I love the idea or the notion of, interweaving some of these powerful plants. I'm sure I'm not the first. You're not
Yeah,
the
I mean, I've heard a
first.
lot of people have described that they like after when you start to come down from the psilocybin.
Mhm.
I mean, you don't have like a withdrawal feeling or anything like that,
No.
but it's just nice to use the cannabis as part of that to like re-entry into normal life, I
Yeah.
guess. So
Yeah.
I think that's a common tool is that people are using like a light dose of cannabis when they're on the downswing from the psilocybin. So yeah.
Love it. I like that too. Um, I was gonna ask, do you have, um, any plans to partake in another larger dose, or were you kind of feeling like
Yeah.
y
I mean,
oh,
the thing is, like, I had such a great experience with my first couple of macro doses that, and I've had
oh,
a
I see, okay.
lasting effect from it,
Mhm,
and that's been really great. And so I haven't felt like the push to do
mhm,
repeated macro doses, which I think is a testament to psilocybin itself. I mean, I think everyone is different too, in that some people may prefer a macro dose like every quarterly or every six
mhm,
months or even more frequently than that. But for me, I haven't really felt that need.
mhm.
And so I mean it's there, and I've microdosed and I've taken slightly larger than microdoses, but not I haven't done like a full huge macrodose in a few years now. And I think it's because I've been so connected to that experience that I haven't felt that need. And I'm not against recreational use with psilocybin, but it's not my drug of choice for recreational
Sure.
use. Like
Yeah,
again, cannabis would be something that I'm more inclined to use in public as like a social lubricant and that
yeah.
kind of thing. Many people rely on psilocybin as a microdose for that. I just haven't really found that it's the right tool for me for that because I mean I have a tendency to go very internal.
Yeah, it can
I'm
be
as a
it's
writer, I
yeah.
guess. I don't
No, I
know.
think it's really challenging and quite frankly, up down to the dose. So, I
Yeah.
I find that, it's hard for me to determine, am I having an inward moment or, like, it's hard it's challenging to use recreational because of that. If you're aware that you can be, taking this time to be going inward and say, but I think it also can have the exact opposite effect where you are just laughing and
Yeah.
you can't get enough socialization. So
Sure,
it
absolutely.
provides what you're needing. That's what I say.
Absolutely, I agree,
Yeah.
and so I think everyone has to find their own, like, what works best for
Yeah.
them in terms of that, and so I think I will try to explore, more of microdosing in a social setting. I just in terms of psilocybin, I just haven't really done that yet. I've done that more at home.
Love it. Well, I think that's where I was going with that question, like how you determine when you're planning to use, or cathartically, but that all makes sense, and I love to hear that you've had such a profound, experience,
I have, yeah.
you can feel it in your words and see it, and, I love again, yeah, let's talk about how people can, um, get your guide, your handbook that you put together.
Yeah, thank you. So the Psilocybin Handbook for Women is available pretty much anywhere books are sold. You can get it from, any online book source that you use, or you can also order from your local bookstore, anything like that. If you want a signed copy, in my Instagram bio, you can find the link to get a signed copy. You just have to order it through a local bookstore with me, and I'll pop over and like sign it, and they'll ship it out to you.
Oh,
So I
wow.
always offer that just in case somebody wants that or to send a copy to someone as a gift. I'm happy to do that. And then in terms of where to find me, I'm on social media. I'm on all the platforms. You can find my handle is the same everywhere. It's at Jen Chesak. That's Jenchesak. And I'm happy to answer questions like DMs and things like that, especially I'm most active on Instagram, I would say. So people reach out to me. The only caveat there is like, I can't provide you any drugs. that's illegal. And then I also I'm not a doctor, so I can't give you direct medical advice. I can direct you where to look or
Mhm.
provide certain research elements or whatever to inform you. I'm not a doctor, so I can't weigh in on your personal issues. So, yeah,
Well, and I will have all of, where to find you in the episode notes so
perfect.
listeners can find you that way and understood, that you're not a doctor, but just really great work for, putting this guide together. I think it's so
Thank
important,
you.
in this day and age. I feel a lot of women have a hard time, yeah, with perimenopause, for example, and getting
Yeah,
answers and being able to ask questions and it's such an important conversation and affects so many
it
on
does.
so many
It
different
really does.
levels, your cycle
Mhm.
from being able to conceive to, all of the things. So uh,
Absolutely.
I was so excited to meet you and have you on. And
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure. And thank you for doing this podcast.
yes, thank you, Jennifer. And is there anything else before we
No, I
say
think we
goodbye
covered a
for
lot
now?
of really good ground. So thank you.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. This was awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you guys for tuning in. I appreciate it. Have a good one. For more information, please visit mindsonmushrooms.com. Thank you for joining the journey.